now. We've still got our free
UKIP MEP and Thurrock Independence. Back to 1075 tonight, we still have the UKIP MEP and Thurrock Independence Councillor Tim Aker. I believe he's still a UKIP MEP, is that correct?
I sit with the UKIP group.
With the UKIP group. And the Ilford South MP, let me get that right, Mike Gaves, on the show this evening. We're talking about Brexit, obviously. We've seen the Chequers deal recently last week. Theresa May's going to take control of negotiations and kind of reduce the department for leaving the European Union down to a kind of lesser role. What do you think of that decision? Theresa May is going to take control of negotiations.
If I could go first, I think the reality is she should have done that in the first place. She ended up with the resignation of David Davis and Boris Johnson, where probably she should have been to start with, because if she was determined to get a compromise deal of the kind which might be acceptable both in Britain but also with the European Union, she probably ought to have had a much firmer grip on it in the first place. But because of the way that she put three arch levers into those key positions and then just said, you get on with it. Well, we saw the fiasco of Boris Johnson as the most undiplomatic foreign secretary the country's ever had, and that was a disaster waiting to happen. And then David Davis stormed out, apparently because there was another plan which he was working on, and a man called Ollie Robbins, who's the senior civil servant who was working directly to Theresa May, was producing a plan for her. And it's quite clear from parliamentary evidence sessions in select committees recently that Ollie Robbins was always in the driving seat, and now it's been formalised that the Cabinet Office, which basically is the Prime Minister, is going to take the lead, and the Brexit Department, this new Minister, Dominic Raab, is basically going to be subsidiary to the Prime Minister. So I think what we're getting is a recognition publicly of the reality of what's been going on behind the scenes.
Yes, to all those people who came up to me in the 2017 election and said, I've got to vote Theresa May for Brexit. Well, you got screwed, didn't you? She's made it clear now that she has no plans for this hard Brexit she talked about in the Lancaster House speech or through the general election campaign. She sidelined the Brexit department, which she said was going to be headed by Brexiteers, and it's made clear now that this Ollie Robbins that nobody voted for has been working behind the scenes to shepherd Theresa May to this soft, weak, wobbly deal that is going to make no side happy. So again, it's just symptomatic of the shambolic leadership that Theresa May's been giving the country.
You mentioned that there. Do you think that the Chequers deal, I think it was described, well, David Cameron and Boris Johnson described it as the worst of both worlds. Is that something that you would go along with?
Yes, because you can't care only about 10 or 15 or 20% of the economy, which is manufacturing. We are apparently not going to seek some deal on service industry. That's going to be difficult. The position with regard to Northern Ireland, they seem to be going back on what was agreed last December, and it's quite clear that this whole thing could fall apart without a deal on Northern Ireland. And the third thing that I'm concerned about is the whole series, although there are areas of some content in this Chequers document. I mean, it's got quite a lot of pages and paragraphs, 96 if I remember correctly. It has a lot of areas that are not dealt with at all. There's nothing about Gibraltar's status, which could be a sticking point later on with Spain. There's nothing about the other British overseas territory, a little Caribbean island called Anguilla, which borders France and the Netherlands in their overseas territories. That's never not looked at. And the issue of trade and customs is complicated in those cases. And of course, the big thing in the elephant in the room is the status of British citizens living in EU countries. Will they, if I'm living in France and I'm British, will I be able to travel freely to another EU country as I can now? Or will I only have status in France? Those kind of things are very unclear, and they will affect people in this country who've got families who are living perhaps temporarily or longer term in other EU countries. None of that is spelt out.
Well, bear in mind the border between Austria and Germany there's no free movement there. So it's not all hunky-dory in the EU. There isn't completely, they take and break the rules whenever it suits them. So let's bear that in mind. But again, I feel that there's some, common cause here, is that they have not addressed this as seriously as someone who would actually believe in it and want to see that all these issues are thoroughly looked at and that a deal that respects the referendum result is brought to the British people. And it has turned out to a complete mess. Again, with Theresa May, there's always the law of heightened expectations. This was going to be the big meeting and so on. And it just created a air of, well, that wasn't really worth waiting for.
Well, we've obviously talked about the Chequers deal itself. Do you think that the Chequers deal would be able to get through a meaningful vote in the Houses of Parliament?
No.
So where would that leave us?
Well, firstly, the Chequers proposal is just the British government's position for negotiation. That's now got to be looked at and negotiated. It's got to... the EU has got their negotiator, Michel Barnier, who represents all the governments of the EU in the negotiations. It's then got...
Don't forget Verhofstadt of the Parliament.
I was going to make the point. If then there is a European Parliament input as well, this process is that we have to get an agreement between the UK government and all the EU governments. They at the moment have a joint negotiating position, but subsequent to that there's then got to be an agreement by the 27 EU governments and by the European Parliament in a separate vote, as well as a vote by the British Parliament. You ask directly, would this get through the British Parliament? I think not, because the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, who's our shadow Brexit secretary, laid down what he called 6 tests. And my looking at this document from the government is that it doesn't meet those tests. It doesn't meet them over the Northern Ireland question. It doesn't meet them under the key point, which David Davis claimed he was trying to get, was the exact same benefits as we currently have within the European Union. Now, that is not going to be possible, especially if you're going to bring in a position where you're not in a customs union or in a single market, and the implications of that for jobs and prosperity.
I think Mike's just explained why no deal is inevitable. When you've got the European Parliament that will not move an inch on anything, unless, remember, we have a vote in that. The other governments, which again, the European got to join the euro, we're going with no deal, and they should have been honest and upfront with it from the start.
But do you think that Parliament would find a way to make sure that no deal didn't happen?
Well, here's the problem. Here's the thing. You could have a situation where 2 scenarios I see, and Mike's already ruled one of them out, but I could still see it happen, is that Theresa May presents a watered-down Chequers after negotiation with Barnier that the Labour Party support, and it's those votes that get Theresa May's deal through, because she'll rely on votes from the Labour Party and any of the Liberals, maybe the Green, to get it through. So a majority of Conservative MPs could vote against a Prime Minister that gets it through. Or she could turn it into a confidence motion, like John Major did over Maastricht. And then that's going to put a lot of pressure on Conservative backbenchers and so-called Brexiteers. What do they put first, their party, career or country? And we'll see then, like we probably did see in the early 90s, where they'll fall in line and do what the whips tell them.
I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think the way I look at it, the Conservative benches are riven by divisions at the moment. And I think there are a group of probably 50, 60, 80, and they've already been threatening to trigger a leadership contest. And I think there are a group of them who probably want, as Tim does, a no deal, and therefore will vote against any deal at all, almost to try and bring about a no deal.
Oh, I've thought that from the start, sorry to interrupt you there. I've always thought that from the start, but the thing that annoys me is that they're not honest about it.
Right. Okay.
You won't get them saying, "Yeah, I want no deal." Right. They always try and say, "Oh, the Prime Minister gives us this deal."
Whereas there's another group of Conservative MPs, it's probably a smaller group, who would want to stay in the single market, the customs union.
The Anna Soubry's there.
And then there's a further group who will try and be as loyal as they can to Theresa May, whatever position she takes. And I think the Conservatives are divided, but then, to be fair, the Labour Party is also divided. There are a large number of Labour MPs, including me, who basically want to support staying in the single market and a customs union, and also believe that any deal should be put to the people to determine whether we decide it is as good as what we have now. So that if there was to be a referendum on the package, it should have three options in it, not just the Theresa May's negotiated deal or crashing out with no deal. It should also have the option to remain. Now that will require legislation. I don't think there's a majority in Parliament for that yet. Then there is the other group. There are what people, you could call them left-wing Brexiteers or Lexiteers. They're a very small group, but they sadly include several people in very senior positions in my party.
Thank God for that.
And as a result, the Labour Party's position is divided. And so we have a small group of Labour MPs who have voted with Theresa May. We've also had others who have abstained, and then there are another group of us who voted for single market and customs union and to stay as close as possible to the EU. I think when it comes to it, and there are lots of other votes as well, because there's the SNP, there's the Northern Ireland DUP, there's a few Liberal Democrats and the one Green MP. So Parliament will have. We've had some very close votes already recently.
Well, the bearing business.
Yeah, I think when it comes to this decisive vote, assuming that Theresa May gets a deal, which I think is not certain at all, it could well not be the case, but then Parliament is supposed to have that come back to us in October or November, and at that point I think it could be very close, it could be very uncertain, there could be splits and divisions in all parties, and it really depends upon what that deal says as to whether it gets through. And I think it's quite possible Parliament could vote it down.
Could do. It's in the hands of Jeremy Corbyn, isn't it? I mean, a man who for the past 40 years has been voting against EU treaties, and even the vote to go in, or the vote to come out in 75, went very quiet in the referendum, and lots of people suspect that was deliberate. I'd love to know how he voted. I think he voted leave. What do you think?
He said he voted remain, so I assume you have to believe him.
Well, I'd like to think differently, but again, we're in the position where you have the Conservative Prime Minister who says she is the best Brexiteer going and voted Remain, and a Labour leader who for 40 years has been voting against the European Union and says he's for Remain. You couldn't make it up.
We're going to have to go for a break there, but we'll be back shortly with more on the Brexit talks with Tim Aker and Mike Gapes as well, but we'll be back after this. We're going to have more from Tim Aker, the MEP and MP for Ilford South, Mike Gapes, coming up shortly. We're going to have that second hour of the show. This is going to go for 2 hours, this Brexit debate, because so